Okay, hello everybody. Either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this video. So today we're going to learn about pesticide resistance and antibiotic resistance. Okay, so this is going to apply your understanding of what we learned about in the previous day, which was natural selection, right? So you learned that with Mr. Blasi. And so what we're going to start with is a recap of that lesson. So go ahead and look at this picture here, right? So it's showing over a 3-month time span we have this predatory hawk and these prey mice, right? So the hawk eats the mice. Over time, you're seeing that the mice change, right? And so what I want you to do is answer these 3 questions under those 3 bullets in your guided notes. Okay, so the first question, second, and the third. Go ahead and pause. Take a moment to answer these, then we're going to go over it. Okay, so by this time, you should have answered these 3 questions. So what we're going to do is going to go over them now. We're going to first, again, look at this picture. So we see the first month, there is a hawk, and it's eating some of these mice. Now let's look at how the mice start. We have different variations, right? So all you see that's different are that some mice have darker fur color and some have a lighter fur color, right? So the variation in the mice, is that there is variation in fur color, right? Either dark or light. Okay, so that's the first question answered, right? The variations we see in the mouse population there is in fur color. It's either dark or light. Now, which mouse is best adapted for this environment? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the environment, right? So the environment here is just there's a dark background, right? So maybe they're on like a dark colored rock. For example, there are rock pocket mice, which live either in an environment of light colored sand, right? In which case the light colored mice would be hard to see. They would be better adapted for sand. But here is more like a dark colored background, much like volcanic rock, right? So rock pocket mice can live in that environment as well. Now, the mouse best adapted here would be the dark colored mice, right? So mice with dark fur color are more likely to survive and reproduce, right? So the mice with the dark fur color are the ones that are better adapted, right? Mice with dark fur color are more likely to survive and reproduce, so they are better adapted to this environment, right? So since having a dark fur color here means they're harder to see, right? They're in the dark background, they're camouflaged. Since they're more likely to survive and reproduce, that means they're better adapted to that environment, okay? All right, now lastly, what type of selection is occurring in the photo? Explain why. Okay, so we see here, when it comes to the variations over time, we have, in the beginning, let's count how many mice of each variation. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 with light colored fur, and 1, 2, 3, 4 with dark colored fur, right, to start out. Now, the next month, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with dark colored fur, and light colored fur, there's only 1, 2. And the last month here, only one of them has the light colored fur and the rest have dark colored fur. So the type of selection that's occurring here, what should come to mind is natural selection, right? So naturally, the mice that were selected are the ones with dark fur, right? Because that variation made it so in this environment, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. So natural selection because mice with dark fur color are more likely to survive and reproduce. Okay, so natural selection is really the same as adaptation, right? So an adaptation here, or rather, adaptation comes from natural selection, right? So an adaptation here would be for the mice to be camouflaged, right? So the dark colored mice have evolved by natural selection. Okay, so just to recap again, Natural selection is when, over time, the variations in population change. One variation increases because it's better fit for the environment. Okay? All right, let's move forward here. Okay, now let's first talk about pesticides. Okay, so pesticide is just a chemical used to kill insects. So, of course, this would be used most likely by farmers. Here are some farmers there, right? So, in this picture below, they're spraying this chemical, right? So, they're spraying it out of these giant canisters and they're spraying all their crop, right? So, all these plants end up getting pests that start eating them, right? There are lots of insects that will eat the plants. For example, aphids are these tiny, tiny little insects that will just devour all of their leaves of the plants. And of course, without leaves, the plants can't do photosynthesis. So they're not going to produce much fruit. Now, what they start doing is these farmers spray all this pesticide, and turns out they're trying to kill the insects, but some survive. Insects that survive this have what's known as pesticide resistance. So, this is an inherited trait which leads to insects not being affected by pesticide or insect killer. Okay, so again, pesticide means you're killing insects. And if you have pesticide resistance, you inherited the trait where you're not going to be killed by it. So, what should come to mind here is that this is a problem, right? Farmers are trying to kill these pests, but some are resistant to it. So, it's not going to be 100% effective. Okay, so that's pesticide resistance. So, let's take a look at this right here. Suppose there is this bug. Let's say it's an insect, for example, right? Same species, but they're different variants. So, the variation here is that they're either born easily being killed by pesticide, or they're born where they're not affected by pesticide. So some insects are born with pesticide resistance. In other words, an insect can have a gene for pesticide resistance, or an insect could have genes where they don't have pesticide resistance. So what I want you to think about here is, which bug do you think was best fit for the farming environment, right? Is it better for the bug to be easily killed by pesticide? Or is it better for the bug to be not affected by pesticide? So take a moment to think about that. Pause the video. All right, so what you should have come up with is that it's better for the insect to be resistant to the pesticide, right? So if you're resistant to pesticide, you're in the farming environment, the farmers are not going to be able to kill you with that insect killer. Okay, so it's beneficial for the insect to be pesticide resistant. So that means that this should evolve by natural selection. Over time, as pesticides get used, the pesticide resistant insects are going to survive. Those are going to be the ones that reproduce, and there's going to be less of these, right? If they're easily killed by pesticide, they die off. There's not a lot of them to reproduce, but the pesticide resistant ones are left standing and do pass on their genes. Okay? So here's another picture showing this over multiple generations. So again, we have these light-colored insects here. They're not born with resistance. They don't have the gene for it. And you see there's lots of them in the beginning. And you see that some of these are born pesticide resistant. They have the gene for resistance. Now, over generations, the farmer's spraying pesticide. So let's look at the beginning. There's lots of those born without resistance, and only a couple with the resistant gene. Let's look what happens when you first spray the pesticide. In the first generation, after some of these get killed, here's the offspring that result. So you see there's now only a few that are not born with resistance, right? There are only a few that are left of that variety. But there's a little bit more that have the pesticide resistance. So you should be starting to see that there's more with the resistance gene than there was in the beginning. Now let's see what happens when we spray pesticide again. In the next generation, even more of the ones born without resistance die. But the ones with resistance start to reproduce, right? So there's more of them with resistance, and you spray the pesticide again on these, right? So these three are susceptible, they might die. The other ones, not so much, because they have the resistance. In the end, this third generation, you should now see there are a lot more with pesticide resistance than there were at the beginning. So this calls out natural selection, right? So naturally, the insects that are born with pesticide resistance survive. They're the ones to reproduce. So insects with pesticide resistance are selected over time to survive and reproduce more often. So pesticide resistance increases over time, right? So that's what natural selection results in. It results in more of one variation than the other. Okay, so this is pesticide resistance. Now, what I want you to start thinking about is why may the continued use of pesticides be harmful to the environment, right? So we're spraying all these pesticides on the crops, and well, it says it right here. It increases the amount of pesticide resistant insects in the population, right? So you're getting more and more of these insects that have the resistance. So what you should realize here is that as you use the pesticides a lot, they're going to become more and more resistant to them. Meaning, if you keep using this, it's not going to work, right? The more you use it, the less it works. Okay, so that's certainly harmful. You're increasing the amount of these resistant types, right? So that's going to be bad for other farmers. They're starting to get these resistant pests. They're not going to be able to kill them off. That's harmful for the farming environment. You could also say pesticides could harm human health. These are on crops that humans consume, and pesticides could be present where once you consume them, they're harmful to your body, right? So that's another harm to the environment. Or it could kill other insects that you didn't intend to, right? It could get in the water supply. It could affect other insects in there. It could even affect fish. It could affect all sorts of things, right? So it's not always good to use pesticides. Okay. All right. So now a related topic here, right, is antibiotic resistance. So let's start off with what is an antibiotic. So this is specifically a drug used to kill bacterial pathogens. So what should scream out here is this word right here, bacterial. This is not insects anymore. We're talking about only bacteria, right? So remember from your immune system unit, a pathogen is something that can enter your body and infect you, right? So bacteria, of course, are all over us. They're all over our environment, and some of them enter our body and cause infection. E. coli, for example, is already present in our gut. We have E. coli there, and it's actually synthesizing vitamin K for us. But if you get gut E. coli on your lettuce, right, it basically comes from feces on top of lettuce. So, in other words, it's been contaminated. If you go out to the store and you buy lettuce contaminated with E. coli, what's gross about that is it's probably been exposed to fecal matter, feces, right? Poop. And we don't want poop on our lettuce because it has bacterial pathogens, right? If you consume E. coli from that lettuce, it's going to infect you. It's not the E. coli you have in your system, it's a different strain. So, what you'd have to do in that case, if you get infected by E. coli or any other type of bacteria, you take antibiotics. You go to the doctor, they figure out that it's a bacteria because they do some type of culture, right? They do like a cotton swab of your mouth, for example. They run it on a petri dish and they grow bacteria. If they see pathogens in that culture, they're probably going to prescribe to you antibiotics because they're going to want to kill bacteria in your body. Now, again, The same thing with pesticides here. Some of these bacteria have an inherited trait which leads to them not being affected by antibiotic, right? So some bacteria die from it, but some are resistant. Now, the key thing here is that the bacteria do not become immune because they don't have an immune system, right? So instead of immune, I want you to use the word resistant, right? So the bacteria are resistant because they're not going to be killed by the antibiotic. Okay, now, again, like with the insects, here are two varieties of the same species of bacteria. For example, E. coli. By the way, E. coli stands for Escherichia coli, but I don't expect you to say Escherichia, so you can just say E. coli. Some of these E. coli are easily killed by antibiotic. Some are not affected. So some are born with antibiotic resistance. So what I want you to answer in your guided notes here is which bacteria do you think was born with an adaptation best fit for survival? Then explain. Go ahead and pause the video and answer this in your notes. All right, so hopefully what you've come up with is the fact that the bacteria here that are resistant are better adapted for the environment, right? So which bacteria do you think was born with adaptation best fit for survival? The bacteria with antibiotic resistance are better fit for survival when antibiotics are used because they resist the drug that was supposed to kill them. Right? So the ones that are easily killed by antibiotic, of course, die off. The bacteria with antibiotic resistance are resisting. Well, they're not being killed by it, right? So there's more of them over time. Okay, so the bacteria with antibiotic resistance are better fit for survival when antibiotics are used because they resist the drug that was supposed to kill them. Okay, all right. Now, why do you think it'd be harmful to use antibiotics too often? So, what should be coming up here is this picture right there. We have treatment of antibiotics, right? So we have all these bacteria here. These shaded ones, again, have the resistance. They have the resistance gene. So now, first day, there's only one that has it. Second day, after treatment with antibiotics, a lot of the ones easily killed are killed. There are now more with resistance. Third day of treatment, now it's only the resistant bacteria. And the fourth day, the resistant bacteria they don't care that there's antibiotic, they survive, and they reproduce even more. So why do you think it's harmful to take antibiotics too often? Imagine you did this for every bacteria that came into your body. What would happen is that there will be more bacteria with antibiotic resistance, right? So what you should see here is that if you use antibiotics too often, you're actually just going to produce more with resistance. So if you get infected again with a second infection, antibiotics will be less effective, right? So now imagine that this was day one where you use the antibiotic again. All of them are resistant. So what you'd expect is that the antibiotics is not going to kill very many of them. And so you've kind of put yourself in a corner where since you've used the antibiotics a lot, the bacteria are not going to be able to be treated as effectively. Okay? So you increase the amount of bacteria resistant to antibiotics, which means this type of medicine may no longer be effective. Okay, so the more you use antibiotics, the less effective they become. All right, so now what we should talk about here is the fact that bacteria are single-celled. So sexual reproduction is not what's leading to the variations. What do you think causes the difference in genes for single-celled organisms? Okay, so what you should come up with here is mutations, right? So mutations are always what lead to variations. Remember that mutations are just changes in your genes, right? So a gene changes so that now some of the single cell organisms have antibiotic resistance, right? That's how it came about in the first place. Okay? So a follow-up question here is how do you think genes are passed on for single-celled organisms, right? So we established here mutations lead to variations in single-celled organisms if they asexually reproduce, right? Single-celled organisms have only one parent, asexual reproduction. How do you think the genes are passed on? So go ahead and pause the video and give this a shot. All right, so what you should come up with here is that asexual reproduction leads to inheritance of identical genes. So if you have one parent that reproduces by asexual reproduction, you're going to have inheritance of an identical genes, meaning that you will have the same traits. Right? So if you inherit identical genes, you most likely get the same traits because genes lead to traits. Okay? So in this case of antibiotic resistance, since they reproduce asexually, antibiotic resistance is passed on by all resistant bacteria, right? So if you inherit the identical genes, then any bacteria with resistance are going to automatically pass that on. There's no sex reproduction that will mess around with things, meaning it won't rearrange all of their genes like it would with humans. For bacteria, they're passing on all of their genes. So if they're born with resistance, they're going to continue to have that resistance. Okay, so what you should see is that is a huge problem with antibiotic resistance because more and more of them are going to be born with that trait. Okay, so we've done these Regents questions before. What I'd like to do now is just review them. So this was from an antibiotic resistance lesson that we had previously, where you watched a different video and you answered these questions. So the first one here was this graph about resistance to vancomycin. It's a type of antibiotic. So you should see throughout the years here, you're getting more and more resistant bacteria, right? A higher and higher percentage, right? So this should indicate around this time, antibiotics started to be using. So it increased over time because as antibiotics were used, the resistant bacteria were the ones to survive and reproduce. Now, an important point here is, well, what can we do about this? This is a huge problem, the fact that there's lots of resistant bacteria now, and we still want to use the antibiotics. So what scientists can do is, well, they could use a different antibiotic. They could develop one where the bacteria don't have the resistance gene for that. So that would be more effective. Or you could develop a vaccine against bacteria instead. So rather than just using antibiotics at all, why not just inject with vaccines and allow your immune system to attack the bacteria? So that avoids this whole issue of resistant bacteria, right? The vaccine will help your immune system fight against them. Okay. Okay, so the next question here had to do with pesticide, right? So we spray this on the insects. This comes straight from the notes. The concept represented here is a phrase that means That's often used in place of natural selection. It should be survival of the fittest. In this environment, the insects with the best fit, right? The variation with the best fit are the ones with resistance. Those are the ones that survive. That is what's meant by that phrase. Okay? All right, this question here. Which statement is not part of natural selection? So let's see. Individuals that possess the most favorable variations will have the best chance of reproducing. Absolutely, that is part of natural selection. So that is not the choice, right? That's not the one we're going to pick because we're looking for not part of natural selection. Okay, next, variation occurs among individuals in a population. So we should think back to the mice where there were different variations here. Excuse my little drawings of mice. And some were, right, some had dark fur and some had light fur, right? So variation absolutely occurs among individuals in population. Here's one individual with dark fur, and here's another individual with light fur, right? So that does happen. More individuals are produced than will survive. So what should come to mind is overpopulation. We learned that from yesterday's lesson, right? Overpopulation. Okay, so overpopulation means that exactly what this says, right? A lot of these mice are going to be produced, but only some of them are going to survive, right? That's a whole huge part of natural selection. The ones that survive are naturally selected. They're the ones that increase over time. Here's the last choice. Genes of an individual adapt to a changing environment. Now, this is the part that's wrong. Genes of an individual. That's not what we're talking about here. We don't get mice with black fur because that they needed to. We get mice with black fur because a random mutation made it come up. In the rock pocket mice, there's an MC1R gene. That's the name of the gene that determines their fur color. A mutation in the MC1R gene led to black fur color. When that mutation came up, those mice were more likely to survive and reproduce, so they were increasing by natural selection. So the genes of an individual never changed. They were born with their genes. The ones without the genes for black fur color were more likely to die. The mice born with the genes for black fur color were more likely to survive. So their genes do not adapt. The genes of the individual do not adapt. The genes of a population, which is a group of organisms, do adapt, right? So this should be choice 4 because they evolve as a group, not as individuals. Okay? All right. So the last thing here is we want you to do the summary here. So these are actually flipped. On yours, this is option A. Write sentences with the word pairs below. Or you could do option B, which is to match up each of these terms with the A positive that describes it. Okay, so go ahead and do that on your guided notes. And that's really all for today. So again, we learned about pesticide resistance and antibiotic resistance. We learned how some pests are born with the ability to resist insect killer, and some bacteria are born with resistance to antibiotic. So we saw how that's a problem. We saw also how this is evolution by natural selection, because over time, the individuals with resistance survive and they pass on genes for resistance. So over time, more and more individuals with resistance will result. Okay, so everybody make sure that you complete your summary, fill in all of your guided notes, and see you again next time. Okay, thanks so much.